So thank you for inviting me. I will probably be slightly off from what Opera does usually during the JournalClub. And I'll introduce myself a little through what I've been doing with my life. I worked in a smart shop way too long, which was a very invigorating experience in the beginning, and became someone they might be watching. Less invigorating in the end. I worked for an organization called Unity that offers peer-to-peer drug harm reduction information on festivals and parties. I worked with PsyCare, which offers psychedelic harm reduction on festivals, so guiding people through very challenging psychedelic experiences on festivals. People might be combining LSD with ketamine, amphetamine, think they already died, and potentially need some help to wrap their head around their out-of-body experience. And I'm still volunteering for the Open Foundation that is currently collaborating with Opera to organize the wonderful ICPR 2020. So if you haven't already looked into that, please do so. The early birds are going really fast. I studied anthropology and sociology on the other university in Amsterdam, and I finished my master's in spiritual care in the Buddhist track here on the VU. And what else did I do? I worked for Trimbos Institute. I mentioned this because it gave me quite a good insight into how rather conservative researchers and scientists look at psychedelic psychotherapy and the popularization and the public discourses around psychedelics that might impact how the general public perceives of psychedelics and their risks and their benefits. And I currently work for Synthesis Retreats. For those that are familiar with psychedelic sitting services in the Netherlands, you might know this organization. For those that don't, there's a large field of organizations that offer guided psychedelic experiences, often using truffles, which are legal in the Netherlands. Some of them used to use ayahuasca, some still do underground, some switch to psilohuasca. And this allows me to work with people in altered states of consciousness on a weekly basis. We have retreats every weekend. And so there's a large range of experiences I can draw from when I'm crafting the sort of theoretical work that I would love to present to you, called Psychedelic Chaplaincy. I also want to be very frank about the fact that I have certain faith commitments. I'm a practicing Mitsum Buddhist, and although I personally sometimes feel that doesn't really influence my thinking nor my scientific rigor, but obviously everyone with certain faith commitments might have blind spots and biases, so I name this now so you can reflect on whether I might have blind spots. I try to accentuate these when they come into play, but please challenge me on this. And lastly, together with Marta, we're founding the Guild of Guides, which is an organization that seeks to professionalize psychedelic sitting services both in the Netherlands and internationally. And again, some of the material that I would love to present to you is deeply influenced by our thinking around what does it mean to do this type of work in an ethical way that is grounded in therapeutic best practices and in spiritual care best practices. Before I outline a little bit about what I would like to say today, I'm wondering who here has ever heard of spiritual care before this lecture? Okay. And who of you are studying spiritual care or religious studies or theology? One person. Okay. That gives me a bit of an understanding how deep I need to maybe explain some concepts. Who has a therapeutic background? Okay, much more. What? Therapeutic background. Psychologist, therapist, body-oriented psychotherapy. Okay. So I kind of did something very, very stupid, which is say yes to give this presentation. Originally, I was planning to do this presentation in 5 months for the ICPR, And then I got invited, and I couldn't help myself from saying yes, which I shouldn't have done because I was way too busy. But to the extent that my thoughts have fully consolidated into the points that I would like to share with you, here we go. So what I try to convince you of is that interfaith spiritual care, and I'll explain some of these concepts that you're going to see, is concerned with navigating the pluralistic moral sphere or spheres that our society is characterized by. And that it is primarily supporting people in the formation of their identity to the extent that narrative identity is related to wider discourses of meaning. Is this language going to make people feel very uncomfortable, or was this something you could all follow?
Chill.
Chill? Good. Okay. Because then I know where we can take this. So I also want to convince you of the idea that interfaith spiritual care is concerned with meaning making, and quite obviously, thank you for the introduction, that psychedelics can be understood as meaning-making tools. They enhance our capacity to make meaning and to endow meaning on things that might have less relevance than they actually have, or switched around a little bit or flipped a little bit, that psychedelics might be tools that elicit how important something actually is that we downgraded in our perception in terms of meaning and purpose. I will try to sell you on the point that psychedelic chaplaincy as a form of interfaith spiritual care is concerned with understanding psychedelic experience and the place that those experiences have in the lived experience or embodied experience of the clients that go through psychedelic psychotherapy or have another practice within what is sometimes dubbed entheogenic spirituality. And what else am I going to do? I need to check because I literally finished this presentation 2 minutes before the first people came in. I'm going to argue that psychedelic chaplaincy is an important form of care that can be added to psychedelic psychotherapies and that has avenues of research that could be followed that could really, on the one hand, offer critical perspectives to psychedelic science, but also could deepen our understanding in terms of what makes psychedelics so valuable for the therapeutic process. And I will do that in, I'm going to try 30 minutes, so probably 45. I am known as Detailed Daan within our organization. Oh yeah. And that's not a nickname that I deserved because I stick so much to the general outline of something. I tend to get lost sometimes. So if I do, please call me out on it and we can move on. So spiritual care is basically the art or profession, if you will, of supporting people in their existential and spiritual needs. And to those that are a bit sensitive around words like spirituality, like myself, I often offer the word existential. Spiritual pretty quickly can have allusions to unseen realms, spirits, ghosts, all sorts of these kind of things. But I really like to use the word in a more secular way, as referring to the existential dimension of life. The reason I do like to use spiritual rather than existential is that existential often has a very strong, powerful connotation with existentialism, and I don't think that that connection is fruitful for the profession at large. However, I think it's important to understand spiritual care as helping people orient themselves in the moral space. And the moral space in the theories that I use is referring to the good. And to make that a bit more concrete, according to Schumann and Daan, they have been writing a lot on what modern or contemporary spiritual care could be conceived of. Within a secular society, we could think of spiritual or the moral sphere as relating to the good. The good as a transcendent quality, something that is a movement beyond the ego, that helps us relate to reality at large. So we're talking about transcendental values, and it's an engagement with the reality of human vulnerability, human suffering, beauty, and, according to them, evil, which, to my taste, also kind of shows that they are still people coming from a Christian background. So, still, they draw on the work of Taylor. Has anyone heard of Charles Taylor? Okay. So, he conceives of the good as that way what makes life worth living. He considers visions of the good as sort of frameworks of orientation that can help us envision what my personal life or your personal lives would be if they are fulfilling. And often in any of these conceptualizations, there's this strong emphasis on the fact that it doesn't just include the good, but also our relation to the quote-unquote bad or difficult aspects of human life. As I said, we need to understand a little bit about our current society. So I'm not sure if you can read this. It's very, very small. Yeah, we're going to get such a long slide with very small things. I'll go through this quite fast. So, secularization is often understood by the sociologist Weber as a disenchantment of the world. As science is moving into our Western civilizations and becomes more and more dominant, it becomes more and more difficult to believe in things that are not scientifically proven. According to some, this leads to a devaluation of emotion, of certain aesthetic appreciations, because those cannot simply be caught with the rational scientific episteme. And so there's a move from a society in which God is considered sort of the epitome of meaning. The existence of God goes unchallenged, and society slowly opens up. There's multiple perspectives coming into society, so we become pluralistic. There's no longer one view that convinces us to believe in a certain way. There's now different ways of thinking about the world. And in relation to this, we see that there's a separation of the nation and the church. So far, so good? Good. Okay. So this brings us to pluralism, the idea that there's a multiplicity of coexisting and sometimes competing spiritual, religious, existential, or moral ways of being in the world, of understanding the world, of endowing the world with meaning. And my favorite anthropologist, Jared Zigan, talks about the range of opportunities that we have on a daily basis to understand ourselves in relation to the world around us. And he talks about morality as something that is deeply embodied. And as an example, you might think of this as, who had a coffee this morning? Okay. Who, when they had this cup of coffee, contemplated the impact that your coffee choice might have had on people on the other side of the world? Yours? Seriously? I was like, okay, there we go. That would be beautiful. So what this theory basically suggests is that the moment we order coffee, there's no moral reflection going on. It's an embodied choice. Yet the moment that we bring this to our awareness, we all start to think, oh, hey, actually, my coffee drinking choices might have impact on people on the other side of the world. So there's this whole ethical dilemma that suddenly opens up. This opening up of ethical dilemmas is coined, or is what he terms an ethical breakdown. It could be a small one, like this very gentle conversation that we have. It could also be a massive one. But in general, we don't actively reflect. So in general, our morality is deeply embodied. Our spiritual outlooks on life, religious outlooks on life, they're embodied. Please come in. They are not subject to continuous consideration and ethical reflection. Although there are some spiritual practices that might try to bring you there so that you cultivate continuous mindfulness, for example. Another characteristic of our current civilization is individualization. is individualization, which the Dutch thinker and theorist around spiritual care, Schilderman, is sketching as emancipation from conventional structures of authority. So these religious authorities that we used to have, the church, later we had what is referred to, I think in English, a pillarized society in the Netherlands. We had the socialists, we had the liberals, we had the Protestants, and we had the Catholics. And slowly these traditional structures of thinking started to break down. And what that translates into, practically speaking, is that we're going to have a sort of sacralization of identity. It becomes more and more important what your personal life story is, and it becomes less and less important what your place within a wider whole is. So if you get born in the pillar of socialism, you already know what you're going to vote, what bars you're going to go to, even how you could have sex. There's beautiful anthropological work done on different ways of being in the world within those different pillars. But individualization broke this open. It allowed a new range of opportunities for us to lead the lives that we want. And so we see that there's a heavy emphasis on very personalized spiritualities as well. There's a couple of people that think about this that say rising religious plurality, global migration, and the popularity of personalized spiritualities are actually challenging these theories of secularization. Is it actually true that people don't believe that much in God anymore? Or is there a change in how people believe? They say there is this sense of believing without belonging. And this has been used to describe the resacralization of society rather than the disenchantment, particularly through new spiritualities that exist apart from organized religion. And this brings us closer and closer to the contemporary work that spiritual caregivers do, because now spiritual care could be conceptualized as supporting people in the creation of very idiosyncratic, so very personal, very individual, individual frameworks of meaning making. Again, checking in. Does this still make sense, or did I lose some of you? No? Good. Okay. So what we see is there's a shift from grand narratives to life narratives. It becomes a personal quest to make meaning of your life. And I think one of the things that we've been seeing across the globe, and there's a beautiful book by Alexander, for those who would like to read into this, that describes the myriad complexities of neoliberalism, capitalism, and the ways in which this tends to erode our sense of meaning on ever deepening ways, and the ways in which our current social and economic structures tend to continuously disrupt the very socialities that we develop, with as a result that people feel a diminished sense of meaning, which has a quite tremendous impact on mental health especially. Spiritual care characterizes itself, there's a difference between spiritual care and therapy. This is the main thing. Most spiritual caregivers are representative of a sort of religious affiliation. Traditionally, you would see that there's going to be Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and humanists doing this kind of work. And in the last couple of years, there's a massive explosion. So Buddhist wouldn't really be a traditional Dutch thing. That's more of a new thing. But spiritual caregivers that work in a hospital or in hospice or in addiction care, for example, are often not just a representative of a religion, or not primarily a representative of a religion. Rather, they can also function as, and I love this word in Dutch, medemens, just a fellow human being that has developed the capacity to articulate the entire range of human experiences and all the different subjective expressions of that, and that is capable of walking with you as you move through addiction, as you move through a disease, and that has a capacity to empathically connect to you, but can draw on their own life as well. So rather than them being a therapist creating a sort of hierarchical difference, obviously there's always a power disparity at play, but you try to close that gap a little and engage with someone as a fellow human being, with the result that one of the, he's not famous I think, but more known spiritual caregivers that works in addiction care here in Amsterdam says, often I stand next to the coffee machine and the clients come to me asking, what am I here for? What kind of drug am I kicking the habit off? So there's this complete blending in with the clients as if he's one of them. And this creates a completely different basis to discuss existential themes than when there's this clear separation. Obviously, anyone that does this kind of work needs to have some grounding in therapeutic practice. And as this is a triangle, some people are more on the religious front, which you tend to see with Protestant denominations. Some people are more interested in therapeutical approaches to doing this work. And some people are really emphasizing just being there. There's a theory of presence in which the idea is, if I do my work, I just show up as a human being, and I try to get rid of all the sort of theoretical ideas and therapeutic models that might be in my head. I just want to show up. I spent a little bit more time on this than I planned because practically no one knows what spiritual care is. So, I hope this clarifies a little bit what the nature of our work is. So there's care rather than cure. We're focused much more on how do you understand your disease than trying to fix your disease, whether that's a mental health issue or a physical health issue. And as I said, contemporary spiritual care can be interfaith, which means, and we're going to get back to this extensively, that it doesn't matter that we're from different philosophical, existential, or spiritual outlooks, but we engage with one another through acknowledging differences and similarities. But you could also work from a purely humanistic, a purely Buddhist, a purely Islamic, or a purely Christian approach. And in those forms of spiritual care, you would primarily engage with someone that has the exact same religious background as you have. And you can use that language together and maybe dig much deeper. There is an issue, though, and according to Harding and his co-authors, chaplains are losing their authority with respect to the spiritual realm, as other healthcare professionals claim that they can and do provide spiritual care. And it's true, there's a booming field of existential psychotherapy. From that field, there's now also logotherapy. There's a particular expression of logotherapy that is being used in the NYU psilocybin study. This is meaning-centered therapy or group therapy. There's transpersonal psychotherapy. For those unfamiliar with transpersonal psychotherapy, it places the persona, the individual that you are, within a wider context and has a decent map of how non-ordinary states of consciousness might look like and how those might impact very personal psychotherapeutic processes. So they have developed a framework in which you can move back and forth between different layers of the human being. There's spiritually focused or spiritually informed psychotherapies, and so there's a lot of therapy going on in which meaning-making and spirituality actually receive quite some intention. And I think it's beautiful to have these things, but I would say there's a lot of focus on this. And not all therapists, not even very good therapists, necessarily have developed a very deep appreciation of their own religious, spiritual, or existential outlook. I know many that have, and that practice in a way that I would personally conceive of as psychedelic chaplaincy. I'm not really hung up on the words or the professional names. But I do think it's valuable to make some sort of distinction here, especially because otherwise this whole presentation would be unnecessary, and I'm basically saying that I'm unnecessary in this profession. So trying to sell you something. This is me trying to make an argument. Room for discussion. So the question is there a place for spiritual care within the secular, pluralistic, and interfaith Marketplace. Now, there are some super duper hot topics that are mega relevant in the field of spiritual care and are also relevant for psychedelic psychotherapies and entheogenic spirituality. You can tell by the caps lock that's there. And then it's followed by very small letters again, so bear with me. Basically, what I just started discussing is how we relate to our clients. And there is a particular way of relating that is known as the particularist position. And this is really where, for me, it becomes very important to contemplate on these subjects. The particularist position basically says, because you as a client and I as a spiritual caregiver have such radically different understandings of life, and use so drastically different words in the meaning that we endow to that life, it is almost impossible for me to bridge that gap and to sit with you in a way that would be conducive. Whereas if we're both Christian, we can use the same references. We can quote the Bible together. We can pray together. And in that sense, it is that Harding is arguing for a return to an explicitly theologically informed spiritual care. He wants to say, we need to think about God. That's a beautiful endeavor. And we need to bring that thinking about God, or we need to bring that thinking about how we relate to reality at large, into the practice of spiritual care. And that should become the sort of ground from which we start to engage with one another. And so they're much more focused on meeting with people with the same religious background, and they're looking for differences with other backgrounds. A word that is often used here is incommensurability. They conceive of religion as different languages, and just as if I speak English and I speak Dutch, that's beautiful, I speak two languages, but if I take my Dutch to New York and I start talking Dutch there to people, they might understand the tiniest bit, but it's very likely that they will think I'm weird or a fool or trying to understand, but we're not getting any closer. And so in this perspective, religions are well-bounded, neatly demarcated things that are incommensurable with each other. They clash. It's almost impossible to bridge the gap from one religion to another, or from secular, atheistic humanism to someone that has religious affiliations. There's also the pluralist position, and basically the idea is that in a society where the proportion of people who report themselves as of no religion is increasing, there's also a need for a discourse on chaplaincy which preserves its core value, this sort of orientation towards the good or towards the moral sphere, but which is capable of speaking to people of all religions. So this is the sort of go-to definition of interfaith spiritual care. Basically, they're saying you're meeting clients from all walks of life, and so you need to be aware of the fact that you and the other have potentially different perspectives. And you're looking for similarities rather than differences. You're looking for what kind of binds us together. An important concept here is spiritual or existential integrity. And I think this is the first point where I hope it becomes clear why this is such a relevant discussion for psychedelic psychotherapy. If I'm a psychedelic psychotherapist, deeply grounded in science, deeply rooted in a often humanistic worldview, maybe transpersonal, but more often than not secular, and I'm going to be working with a Christian client, then there is a need to find ways in which this, and I thank you for introducing these other speakers, in which this meaning-making capacity of psychedelics is opened up within your own personal understanding of the world, rather than a psychotherapist interpreting your experiences in a secular language. Because if you come from a Christian background, that might not be something you're willing to do. In the same vein, if I as a Buddhist would come in and say that's not God, that's emptiness that you're experiencing right there, or even conflate the two, God and emptiness are just the same, I might not be doing justice to the integrity, to the existential integrity of my client. And so I think this is one of the first takeaways that we need to think. So thank you for already kind of raising this issue. And this brings us to the perennial philosophy position, which basically say that all traditions emanate from a similar source, and they are essentially the same. In essence, the core of each religion is the same. Now, as I said, I want to be very honest. This is a framework that I feel very at home in. It fits with my sort of perception of Buddhism and my practice of Buddhism. It fits with a lot of the experiences I've seen. But this might not be what everyone needs. And there's a couple of really good articles written about this. Also, I forgot his name, on Aeon recently, Caves All the Way Down, it's called, that basically says we need to understand that a lot of mystical theory that is now prevalent in the psychedelic research is deeply steeped in a perennial philosophy. And we might need to separate those two. We might need to develop new methodologies that allow us to interpret the psychedelic experiences that people have without the sort of nomenclature that is so typical of the work of Huxley and Otto and Richards. Does this still make sense? Good. Okay. Going way over time. Good. Got this. So often what could happen here is that there is an erasure of relevant differences. So rather than taking this sort of spiritual integrity as a point of departure, we run the risk of interpreting a bit too fast the experience of the other person. Again, this might be a client's perspective too, but you need to understand if you can relate to that. Now this would be my personal position, but I would also refer to it as the sort of personalized position. It is a little individualistic, but I think that you can also perceive of this work as understanding that there's going to be idiosyncratic understandings of your client, which is grounded in the everyday life. As anthropologists, what we do is we look at how religion is actually experienced on a day-to-day basis, how the moralities are deeply embodied. So we're not so concerned with the theological explanation of certain things. We're concerned with how does it actually show up in your life? How do you embody this? How do you work with this? How does it actually inform you? And what we do is that we understand that someone might be Buddhist, like me, or might be Christian, and that is to a certain extent sort of bound up, the discourse that someone has or the lived experience is to a certain extent bound up with that religion or with that tradition. But it's also open-ended. We are in a pluralist society, so we are always exposing ourselves to different ways of being in the world, to different frameworks of understanding. And so what we need to introduce is a sense of positionality. We need to understand that my perspective is always colored by my practices, by my beliefs, and that same is true for the client. And that through this recognition, in the same way that I wanted to start this lecture by being very honest about where I come from and what my background is and what my sort of theoretical background is, it becomes clear to you that I have a particular position. And this doesn't negate the fact that, which I think is the postmodern trap, that you might say, well, then there's no truth. I don't think that's where that necessarily leads to. But in the context of therapeutic practice of spiritual care, I think it's very important that we recognize this positionality. And so we always are informed by the sort of social, cultural context that we live in when we engage in dialogue with our clients. Still making sense? Good. Okay. So another one is multiple religious belonging. Basically, there's Daan Keiman, who is also doing a talk on ICPR. He is doing a PhD on this. It's belonging to or identifying with multiple religious, spiritual, or existential traditions. And again, within this, you see basically different approaches to understand someone that might come from different traditions. A classical example is Jewish Buddhists, people who grow up Jewish and then adopt Buddhist practice. And when you ask them, what are you? They often say, I'm Jewish and I'm Buddhist. So one of the ways of looking at this is pluralistic. It's non-hierarchical. It basically says all these traditions coexist peacefully. They all have the same value. None is better than the other necessarily. And we can compare them primarily to see what kind of similarities emerge. But again, they consider these religions and traditions kind of bounded, nicely packaged things that actually exist. The same thing with particularistic approaches to understanding multiple religious belonging. But they say, well, if I'm Christian, then it's through my Christian lens that I also look at Buddhism. But one of those is dominant. One of those is used to interpret the other, to incorporate the other. And here often there's an emphasis on assessing the differences, because from a Christian theological position, you could say, is Buddhism actually compatible with my sense of God? So you get these different type of questions that come with this position. And then there's feminist and post-colonial, more sort of deconstructive approaches that say, well, this is not bounded entities that are clearly demarcated that you can recognize as such. Rather, these all inform us in different ways. What we carry around are identities that are sort of hybrids of different forms and practices. You might be doing Buddhist meditation, chanting Hindu mantras in a kirtan, and then going to your work where you are very clearly a physicist with secular or even atheistic inclinations. And you can have all those things. And often in this perspective, people are much more interested in questions of power, which is the core of feminist and post-colonial thinking. They perceive of these traditions as open-ended. And so is the same with anthropological approaches. They look at the lived experience, the lived religion as it shows up in your life. And rather than asking someone, are you belonging to multiple religions, you actually study how that shows up in their life. So this is another topic that might be relevant for people that engage with psychedelics and people that support those people. Now for meaning making. This is practically invisible, is it not? Or can you actually... you can read it? Okay. So meaning making typically involves searching for a more favorable understanding of the situation and its implications. This is meaning making in a therapeutic context, mind you. We start to use meaning and our meaning making capacities to change our framing of a situation around in a way that it makes us feel less uncomfortable, or in a way that it actually invites growth, reflection, and all sorts of good things. Meaning making may also entail reconsidering global beliefs and revising goals and questioning or revising one's sense of meaning in life. So meaning making is a sort of general orienting system. And there's a lot of research done into meaning making and its impact on mental health. There's an increased psychological well-being when people experience a lot of meaning in life. Life satisfaction goes up. There's an increased longevity. There's reduced risk of suicidality and depression. It has a very important role in addiction and recovering from addiction. And there's a couple of other fields, especially hospice and end-of-life care, where meaning making is incredibly important. There's a whole theoretical branch devoted to what does it mean to die well in the 21st century. Relevant, according to Park, one of the main thinkers around meaning making, is that about 85% of people worldwide report having some sort of religious belief, with only about 15% describing themselves as atheist, agnostic, non-religious. And I hope that it's obvious now that those three categories don't mean that you don't have any sort of global orienting system. It means it's a different global orienting system. It is practically impossible to go through life without a global orienting system. This is what we do as humans. We make meaning continuously. And while not all individuals are spiritual, spirituality does appear to be central in the meaning systems of many individuals. So although they might not believe in supernatural things or in God or in some sort of divine or invisible reality, still if you ask people, spirituality is a sort of core of meaning-making systems. It's almost 6. I'm extremely warm, and I can imagine you are too. Do you want a break, or do you want to keep going? For break, hands? No? Keep going? Okay. Oh. Okay. So, there's a growing body of research that shows that when we look at the 3 aspects of global meaning making, and you have global meaning making and situational, I don't want to get trapped into this too much, these basically deeply influence your sense of well-being and health. Further, global meaning is pervasively involved in coping with serious illness, and it demonstrates how spirituality, this core concept of global meaning, for many is related to health and involved in dealing with serious illness. Now, Ido Hartogson wrote a beautiful article, I highly recommend everyone to read this, on the remarkable tendency of psychedelics to enhance the perception of meaning, or in other words, to cause things to appear dramatically more meaningful, and I would like to add here, or less meaningful, than they would otherwise seem to be. And one of the things that I miss in a lot of the literature around meaning making is that it can also radically shift your values. It's often talked about as an enhancement, but I say we because some of my colleagues are here, we on a regular basis see people that realize money making might not be the most important thing in my life. Actually, it's family and love. And so there can be reappraisals, there can be changes in value systems rather than just an enhancement of meaning in one particular area of life. The most commonly mentioned of these mediators of psychedelic response are unquestionably spiritually meaningful experiences and experiences of ego dissolution, whose occurrence is often correlated with the success of therapy. We found 2 types of success for therapy. One is the mystical breakthrough, which has very powerful, direct increases in overall well-being, but we also have the emotional breakthrough, the difficult struggle that seems to correlate very highly to ongoing and long-term therapeutic efficacy. So researchers have also suggested a number of other mediators, including relational embeddedness, embodiment, emotional breakthrough, affect, catharsis, visions, and recovered sense of appropriate priorities. And this is really what I mean with this shift. So there's, according to the person there, there's an appropriate reshifting of values. The last issue within spiritual care is spiritual emergency. Has anyone heard of this term? Yeah? Good. So basically, spiritual emergency is another way of saying, and I'll be very blunt and possibly politically incorrect, you're not going crazy, you're having a spiritual awakening. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we're going to see in this emerging field of psychedelic psychotherapies, because a lot of the experiences that people can have under the influence of a psychedelic and in the days and weeks and sometimes months after are sometimes difficult to discern from what we typically know as psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, dissociative disorders, and all sorts of mental health issues. So there's 2 things that I want you to take away from this massive slide. One is there are ways of thinking about these very difficult emotional and personal and psychological experiences without pathologizing them. And we always need to warn for the fact that there is spiritual fundamentalism that might be seeking to understand all of these different expressions of struggle as spiritually meaningful, also when the very source of them might actually be you have schizophrenia, and we need to shift a little bit in how we treat this. Yeah?
How do you differentiate someone from the opposite camp would say that actually they are having a manic episode and they're just appraising it as some kind of religious...
This is exactly what people from within this framework themselves warn against. Like, we should be careful. I think right now is not the right moment to have this discussion. This is extremely difficult because I'm personally very risk averse. So when I have the sense, for example, when you go to any psychedelic retreat, I think the best practice would be to have an extensive medical screener that would check if you have any mental health condition that might have been diagnosed, if there might be a latent mental health issue. And one of the things that we do is we ask people, do you have a family history of psychosis or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia? Because we know from the research that you might have a genetic predisposition to develop these disorders, and especially in relation to previous drug use, age, socioeconomic conditions, and intense life experiences. We're going to see that a psychedelic experience might trigger or might cause these diseases that are very serious. And so I personally am very risk averse and would rather say I don't want to find out if it's spiritual emergence or psychiatric pathology. Much rather I would refer you to something that has a better risk profile. It's not really answering the question. And the other reason is I'm not a psychiatrist. What I would argue in favor of is whether you take a heavy psychiatric approach or a heavy spiritual approach. I think meaning-centered approaches to psychosis would always work best, in which you on the one hand offer a form of treatment, psychiatric treatment, that is oriented at symptom reduction and might be pharmacologically inclined. And on the other hand, you're using meaning-centered approaches in which you try to understand, so okay, even if this is a psychosis, were there spiritually meaningful aspects to it? And could that reprisal of meaning help you change the symptoms into parts of your new life? This is what is referred to as personal recovery. Personal recovery involves much more than losing symptoms. It involves becoming a person again, regaining a personal life that has some value and that has meaning. Not fully satisfied?
I think it would, it's just a topic for its own, I guess.
I honestly think so, yes. And I think it is important to have this topic because we've seen people within synthesis, for example, and on festivals that would present with, especially on festivals, with what has all the characteristics of drug-induced psychosis. And in certain cases, you would want to send people to a psychiatric hospital. In other cases, you might not want to do that.
Right.
And you could see that these people actually make it through to the other side, become completely symptom-free, quote-unquote, but still need to digest a very powerful experience and might need a lot of guidance with that, whether or not they stick with any symptoms or pathological characteristics. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I don't know. I was just running a mind experiment in my mind of what you said. Like, let's say somebody has schizophrenia and he's hearing all these negative voices, and then you give them spiritual care and tell them to make a different meaning out of it, and then they say, oh well, now I believe that this is actually God talking to me, and then that person might, because he has reappraised his condition, has found new meaning in it. I'm just not sure whether then you could say that should be a therapeutic strategy then for somebody, or whether it would be ethical to convince somebody of believing suddenly that that is God who's speaking to them. Or I don't see how.
I think
So.
I think you're pointing out a very important issue here. What I do here is in the example that you give as a mind experiment, it's a very unipolar approach. And I think what most people within, even in the spiritual emergency communities, would argue in favor of is you're going to have a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a couple of therapists, social workers come together and assess a case, and there might also be a spiritual caregiver or transpersonal psychotherapist that adheres to this spectrum and says, okay, we're doing the medication, we're making sure that this person can't harm themselves, we make sure that they come from social isolation, and we help them to enhance their self-care. And also, we're talking on the level of meaning-making. So I would personally never argue for a solely meaning-making centered approach. I think this needs to be integrated in much wider ways. And I think this would be the way forward for psychiatry is when we start to incorporate and integrate these different perspectives. And I personally think it would open up our understanding of disease and the way it expresses itself in our lives, rather than kind of compartmentalize and say this is a purely neurological issue or a pharmacological issue, or we're just going to do talk therapy. I think we need to see an integration of these. That's what I would personally be in favor of. But it doesn't resolve any of the points you're raising right now. So. Yes. So psychedelic chaplaincy. One person is already satisfied, and I have way too little time left. So what I would say is that psychedelic chaplaincy is a form of interfaith spiritual care that is primarily concerned with understanding psychedelic experiences existentially or spiritually, and to place these experiences in the very lived experiences, the embodied lives that people live. This has a dual emphasis then. On the one hand, an orientation within this moral sphere. We try to understand the content, the discursive and experiential content of an experience. I would refer to this as the cognitive moral dimension. And at the same time, we have an emphasis on the embodiment of these experiences. We try to understand their concrete and direct impact on lives as they are lived, and in relation to self, to the community at large, and to the world at large. And I think this would be maybe coined somatic relational moralities. And there is a little dualism here that I personally really don't like. So I would call this sort of dual aspect model, but to kind of draw out that we do both of these things. I think psychedelic chaplains could really add to the preparation for a psychedelic journey, especially because a part of our profession is relating to people's life narrative. Again, in the NYU psilocybin studies, they use a particular form of working with the life story that is very particular to spiritual care. So we could work with existential issues. These are issues that relate to freedom, death, loss, change or impermanence. Big topic is isolation, meaning or meaninglessness. And we could tie this into important life events as well: birth, death, adulthood, career, or going on pension, or retiring. You might be moving house, old age, marriage, divorce, relationships, the whole shebang. I think spiritual caregivers or psychedelic chaplains could have a particular concern around spiritual or religion. And the reason I say this is because a lot of people that come to synthesis, and I know that there's a lot of people that come to psychedelic retreats, that to a very large extent could fall under the umbrella term of healthy normals, which is basically society's way of saying you're not suffering from a mental condition, a mental health condition or physical health condition right now. Most of the people that come and that make it through a very extensive medical screener eventually all seem to have some sort of mental health issue or another. It's just not serious enough to qualify for a big diagnosis. Some people don't experience the problem deep enough to want to go to a therapist, want to go to a doctor to have it diagnosed in the first place. But there is a sort of mystical longing that people seem to have when they come to psychedelics. And there's this sort of longing that people have that brings them to entheogenic spirituality, that people want to go to Peru, to Amazon, drink ayahuasca there, go to the Himalayas to do meditation retreats. I think this is the same longing that people have for a sense of connectedness. We also see a lot of people that have doubts about certain things in their lives, or they don't know where to take their life next. So there's a crisis of meaninglessness, if you will, of people that are often saying they feel trapped in their life. They feel they want to break out, they feel they're bored, they feel they're in the same sort of groove continuously, and often they read Michael Pollan or they've been looking at the news. There's a lot of news on psychedelics, and it seems to become more and more positive. And so there's a sort of religious concern that brings them here. And I think if we just focus on people with mental health issues, there's going to be a very large part that might be also driving people to look for help, that are not just depressed, but also feel that there's a sort of spiritual undertone that we might miss. And what psychedelic chaplains tend to do is not pathologize certain things. We try to understand, okay, so even if you have a depression, how does this express itself in your life? How do you give meaning to that depression? And often what starts to emerge is that people have narrative construction around why they're depressed. It's rare for us to find someone that says, I'm depressed because I have a lack of serotonin. That's not how it works, even if that is what might be objectively going on, and I think you can really deeply doubt that paradigm. I think that's not how people present themselves to people in psychedelic psychotherapy or that come to synthesis or other retreats. So I think it's important to build a therapeutic alliance. I'm not going to go there right now. But the core of what I think psychedelic chaplaincy has to offer is that we try to use the existential discourse that the client works with. We try to offer contemplative practices that are suitable to the client within their sort of framework of reference and meaning making. A very recent study published a couple of months ago shows that mindfulness increased the positive effects of psilocybin, both on well-being but also therapeutic outcomes, while counteracting possible dysphoric responses to the psychedelic experience. And one of the Buddhist teachers involved in this study said there was no one in the entire meditation retreat that had challenging experiences. At Synthesis, we can learn from that because there's a lot of people that do go through challenging experiences because they lack being a professional meditator for 10 or 20 years, which is a large chunk of the study. So for us, the question is, how can we offer contemplative practices in advance of retreats that can increase positive outcomes and decrease dysphoric responses? And it would be beautiful if this kind of stuff could be integrated into regular psychedelic psychotherapies as well. I think it has its place there. Moreover, psychedelic chaplaincy could help navigate religious tensions. What about a Buddhist that took a precept not to take drugs? A Christian that considers psilocybin to be Satan's invention? What about an atheist that wants to reduce a drug experience to simply a drug experience, and there's nothing to it, and yet they might have very profound and mind-boggling experiences that they cannot understand and interpret from their primary secular framework. And this is me speaking from experience, having had quite a few people that couldn't make sense of what has happened to them in a meaningful way. And they could be mediating the relation to the religious, spiritual, or existential community. I think, especially considering how many people are still religious, there's a big need for psychedelic chaplains that could kind of mediate and that could kind of help integrate these medicines when they are going to be used at a much wider scale in society within different existential or religious or spiritual communities. Yeah?
I have a question about psychedelic chaplaincy, how you pronounce it, but you're saying that people have a background from a specific religious background if they're active in this. I don't know, Jewish or Catholic or Protestant. Now, when they become a psychedelic chaplain, should they have a psychedelic experience themselves well prior to be able to be capable of doing this?
So, thank you.
The answer is?
Janice Phelps wrote an article on this question in 2017 about the guidelines and competencies that anyone that is going to guide someone through the psychedelic experience itself, and I would add to that is going to help with the preparation or integration, should have extensive personal experience with non-ordinary states of consciousness. Be those invoked through meditation, through fasting, through sweat lodge, through psychedelics, or through some sort of God helmet, for example. But it's important to understand what can happen when your ordinary sense of self starts to shift or colors become more intense.
Do you think you get the same experience out of truffles as you get out of a sweat?
This is another... I'm not going to open that can of worms. What I would say to speak to this is I think that extensive experience with, for example, sweat lodge would eventually attune you to the fact that you can be very comfortable in a wide range of human experiences that are deeply discomfortable or dysphoric or uncomfortable or painful or symptomatic of deep human suffering. And I think if you want to guide others through a psychedelic experience, one of the things you need is the potential to offer confidence and reassurance even when people are having a deeply challenging experience. And if you become very reactive to the acting out or the aggression or the panic and blind fear that is in someone's eyes, I don't think you can offer that to people. So you need to have a sense of, I've been there and I know there's a way out.
I just want to make one comment about this.
Yes.
Don't you think this is a politically correct comment for somebody working from out of the US, within the US environment, rather than being active here in the Netherlands, where there's legality issues in the US as opposed to here in the Netherlands with the use of psilocybin, for instance?
Do you mean using personal experience with non-ordinary rather than saying personal experience with psychedelics?
My personal opinion is that you need to have the experience yourself. Otherwise, I think it's going to be a bit difficult. But being based in the US, it's quite difficult to make that statement if you're active in this domain.
Yes. So I honestly, personally believe, and I've had very intense experience with holotropic breath work, and very intense experiences with psychedelics. And although there are definitely differences, there are also similarities that would help me attune to people going through either of those experiences. And that's a statement I can really stand by. But the fact that, for example, Compass Pathways is encouraging therapists to have their own experience but not making it a necessity, and not making this a necessity either, I think is very problematic, and I think could really result in harm for clients. I know a couple of people that are involved with the Compass trials in the Netherlands. I know how competent they are. I know how well they can train others. And I think there are ways to deal with this issue. But it's incredibly complicated. And I think what would be much easier is to attract people that guide others that have extensive experience themselves. And I think especially in this tipping point, we need to think about this bottleneck, because this is going to be a problem. But I fear that if there's people that are not well trained, that do not have these competencies, that are going to move into the space, we're going to see adverse effects that could have been avoided. And so I would personally say, No. I think it's a very important discussion. So
but then we can start talking about Poppas and political.
Let's not go there. So let's say you do guide, you offer ongoing support and trust, and I think again this is especially relevant if a psychedelic chaplain is involved when there's a sort of existential or spiritual focus of the retreat, whether that's entheogenic or spiritual, could be in hospice work, could be in addiction care, could be with a midlife crisis. I think in other places, for example, trauma work, meaning is also very important, but I think it's much more important to have deeply certified trauma therapists there. A psychedelic chaplain could be the sort of support facilitator. Often you have two, that's the best practice. Often that's a man and a woman, but that could be or should be open to the preference of the particular client. But in general, I think psychedelic or spiritual caregivers could offer this kind of work, could offer guidance in the actual session itself. But again, this is a could, and I focus primarily on integrating it. So it could be someone that is engaged with preparation and integration and not involved with the actual sessions themselves. So integration support, again, using the client's existential discourse to help them understand the psychedelic experience through offering appropriate narratives that facilitate open-endedness and reappraisal. Yes, please?
I personally wonder always how to find out what the client's discourse is compared to the therapist's without going through extensive sessions to compare the two.
This is a very important question. I think the capacity to establish what that is can grow over time as you build up more practical experience. And I think that there's a balance that you try to seek between, you can ask a lot of information from a client in advance. You can ask them written questions. You can have an hour-long or 2-hour-long or 5-hour-long intake in which people are going to use words to describe their lives. And the more information you get, you can kind of start to map out a little. If I hear people refer to Michael Pollan and say, this is really the way I understand it too, I kind of know or have a sense of what their life orientation might be. On the other hand, and this comes from Buddhist chaplaincy, there's this sense of stepping in with beginner's mind. I try to pretend, at least, that I don't know anything about the other person. I try to see them as a person that just freshly presents themselves, even if I already had 20 sessions with them. Every time I try to meet them anew, because they will have changed. This is one of the core tenets of Buddhism. There's impermanence. So to continuously meet the other person where they are, and then to find a balance between these two. Because this will give safety and predictability, and this creates open-endedness and space for change and transformation. And I think you need to cultivate both. It's incredibly difficult to do this well, and especially when you have short time, so I think it could result in that best practices translate into creating a lot of preparation time with the client and having a lot of integration time too. And then there's all these other methodologies that you could use to avoid a sort of dominance from a therapist versus sort of submissiveness from, or versus an empowerment of the client. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, you can offer contemplative practices. This is some other research that shows that that would be a great idea. And I think, again, psychedelic chaplains can help navigate religious tensions that can be the result of a psychedelic experience. And mediating these tensions in relation to the integration of an experience within a wider community. Again, if you go back to your church where everyone considers you made love with the devil all night, that's going to be much more difficult than when you return to a church and there's a community there that understands the role of psychedelics. Recently, one of the cool articles that circulated in the psychedelic sphere on the internet was why Christians should do psychedelics. I think we will need to have spiritual caregivers and chaplains of all denominations that are capable of going into particular religious communities and find shared narratives that would allow a place for psychedelics within that religious community. If we want to integrate psychedelics into society, we will need to have religious professionals that understand what psychedelics are, that understand how they work, and that understand how they can be integrated rather than thrown out or elevated to this is the truth now. That know how to really value these substances. And I think this is really where integration of psychedelic chaplaincy in psychedelic psychotherapies comes in. It's to offer to therapists mystical narratives or descriptions of religious experiences from different world traditions. It's to offer contemplative practices that fit with the wide variety of backgrounds of clients that might show up. It's to bring these hot topics that we've been discussing today to the sort of wider field of psychedelic science, to create new avenues of research and to make them think about stuff. It can also help to deepen the personal spiritual lives of therapists. This is another one of Phelps' recommendations, that a psychedelic psychotherapist should have a very profound inner spiritual life and have an attunement to that life. And if you don't, then it's going to be extremely difficult to guide others through these type of experiences. And psychedelic chaplains could help with this. And lastly, to support the integration of psychedelic experiences of therapists. As you both mentioned, there might be a lot of therapists that are going to go through these psychedelic experiences that also need to understand how it informs them and their work, and this is something that psychedelic chaplains could do. Research and reflection, I think, changes in existential outlook or in values as a result of a psychedelic experience could be incredibly fruitful to look into. Joost Reeksema is currently doing some qualitative research in the Netherlands. And the development of theological, spiritual, or existential frameworks of understanding psychedelic experiences to offer back to communities is going to be incredibly important. On top of that, critical reflections on psychedelically informed ontologies, psychedelic research, and psychedelic psychotherapy from feminist, post-colonial, theological, and non-materialistic perspectives is going to be crucial if we want to help the entire field forward. I think that psychedelic chaplaincy is really relevant for the future development of psychedelic psychotherapies. And I don't think it necessarily has to be spiritual caregivers or chaplains that are actively involved, but at the very least that they can become participants in the development of competencies, guidelines, and share a lot of the experience that spiritual caregivers have working with people's life stories, working with these hot topics, and bring that into psychedelic science at large. It's adding a focus on existential and spiritually potent material that might be underappreciated or less appreciated within common psychotherapy that is very much focused on pathologies and symptom reduction. So to really bring a sort of holistic view to that. And we could be offering support in the process of meaning making in conjunction with facilitating contemplative practices. In doing that, we could be highlighting the existential aspects of both psychedelics and contemplative practice. There's some research in the Netherlands that seems to suggest that when spiritual caregivers give mindfulness courses, you're going to have a different course with a stronger emphasis on meaning making and existentially interesting themes than when a therapist does a mindfulness training. Then it seems to be, ironically, often focused more on symptom reduction. I say ironically because with mindfulness you try to be with the symptom rather than to reduce it. It could inform and offer critical perspectives to psychedelic science, especially in research into the lived religious experience of clients, pre- and post-psychedelic experience. And I honestly hope that spiritual caregivers, and if there are any students of spiritual care, I think there's none here, that they should engage with this field of psychedelic science and therapy to learn, but also to contribute, because the field of psychedelic science reveals important links between meaning making, mental health, and existential well-being. Hey. Any questions? Go ahead.
I'm really curious what you think about the role of psychedelics in connecting to your subconscious mind, and to the way that psychedelics help you to connect to your subconscious mind, and how you think this effect contributes to the positive effect psychedelics have on mental well-being.
So, if I understand your question correctly, you're wondering, does this sort of revealing or bringing up of subconscious material have an impact on how we appreciate some of that material, or how we appreciate certain things, like how we make meaning in life?
Yeah.
Within our retreats, there's a metaphor that I like to use, and this comes straight from the textbooks of psychedelics. It is psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers. This is Stanislav Grof himself, and when he says non-specific, it relates to the fact that things that are already present, albeit potentially hidden or very small and barely recognizable, i.e. subconscious, it can amplify that. And it can bring it to the fore with such an amplification that suddenly it shows itself in all its beauty or horror. It could be a fear, it could be a desire, and it could be anything in between. The moment you look through a microscope at bacteria and you see a massive bacteria and you're scared shitless, it's easy to kind of step back and realize, wait, this is a microscope, it's amplifying something. This is not the actual size of that bacterium or virus. In the same way, it's very fruitful during integration to realize that the things that you've seen might not be the actual size of what it is. It could be that you start to see the contours of trauma, and that trauma might be even much bigger than you've imagined. You might have been breaking down with the psychedelic a repressive mechanism, and suddenly the trauma is really there. And you need serious help, serious professional psychotherapeutic help to digest and to start working with the trauma. At the same time, it could be that you suddenly realize that you always wanted to live in nature. And you just had this particular desire that has always been kind of tucked away back there because you started your career, and then you had children, and then you bought a house, and then you had a car, and then you had this, and then now you're 50, and you're like, I don't know what I should do with this, and this desire was kind of screaming at you. This is the moment we would say, give it another couple of months for that amplification to wear off, and so you can see that desire at the actual size it is. It might have been hidden, now it's kind of revealed, and you can start looking at that and integrating that. And this is really why I think professional assistance can be beautiful, because it helps you appoint the appropriate amount of meaning to what you've seen. And this kind of ties into what we've been discussing in advance, is I think if you have an ethically acting therapist or psychedelic chaplain, or even a fellow human being, that is encouraging you to explore how important that amplification is, if it's true or if it was an amplification, and what the real size of that is, it can really be beneficial, and you can start integrating that into your life and realize, I don't have to sell all my assets right away and quit my job and leave my partner and live in the forest. I could actually convince them to join me into the forest, and we could live there with kids. And actually, the job might actually be a great source of finance, and I just want to sell half my assets or whatever the thing is. So to really have a sense of what is the appropriate thing of that thing that has been revealed, that thing that has been amplified to you. Does that answer a question?
Perfectly.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, two more. Yeah, or I don't know. I have until very late. So.
Thanks for your insight. So religion can be very healing, and it can really brighten someone's life. I think that. How do you work with people that are attracted to the dark side of religion, where they are sensitive to religious fundamentalism or extremism, where they are anti-science, anti-compassion, anti-law, where they become hateful to other people's opinions? How do you handle those kind of clients?
That is an extremely beautiful question. Did everyone hear the question? Okay. So, first off, I think if you have a proper intake, you could decide that you're not skillful enough to facilitate the experience of a person like this. Because when people really present with a desire to kind of amplify their own darkness, I think you might want to look at trauma, you might want to look at potentially even sociopathy, or there might be something going on there that I would say is pathological. But let's say it's not that, and someone just comes in and you see them and you meet them there. I think this is a question that we cannot fully answer yet, because for a long time psychedelics have been used in contexts where the setting was one of, this is gonna allow you to connect to love, feel more connected. You're gonna shine, and if there's darkness coming out, it's an amplification of darkness. It's not real. It's part of you, and you can now, this is the invitation to integrate that darkness into who you are and to become a whole person rather than a better person. Hatred and anger and fear are parts of human life that can be integrated, and you can that's the idea of holotropic work. You become whole. But let's say someone is really intent on religious fundamentalism. I think the only places where you would see that is, for example, in some of the MKUltra stuff, where the government was actively exploring other sets and settings and see what that could engender. And I think it's interesting to start looking at, there's a couple of Scandinavian cults, like fascist or hyper right-wing nationalist cults that also use psychedelics.
Germany as well. In Germany as well.
In Germany as well? So I think we need to wait for the research. Personally, I think it's going to show that psychedelics indeed are non-specific amplifiers. So I would always opt for, go for the light, integrate the darkness. But there's going to be people that might want to go for the darkness or control and manipulate others to do so. And this is why I think it's very important that as we integrate these medicines in mainstream society, that we start to build narratives of understanding that would protect against that. We build resilient communities. I would really hope that people that have these inclinations, there's a little bit of hope that I have that psychedelics do have something inherent. I secretly hope that if someone with the worst intentions drinks ayahuasca or takes psychedelic like LSD or takes psilocybin mushrooms and has this heart-opening experience and suddenly realizes, we're all divine light, I should. But I'm not sure if they can. I hope so. Does that answer your...
Yeah, I had those kind of healing experiences, so I agree on that part.
Yeah.
I also think there's like mental psychosis, there's also religious psychosis. It's difficult.
I think it's a question of set and setting and seeing how those can influence experiences, and we need to be aware that power disparities play a role in set and setting, that racial issues are going to play a role in set and setting, that other gender and other inequalities are going to impact how we form and shape psychedelic care as a very wide term, and even entheogenic spirituality. But yeah. Does that answer your...
Yeah? I like your answer.
Okay. I'm not sure who...
I just wanted to add something to this.
Yeah, go ahead.
It was because I read that in Brazil they use ayahuasca for prisoners. And so I don't know exactly what they are doing, but I think there must be an experience that it's helping if you are on the dark side, do something eventually.
I think so, but I think it's comparable to some prisons that do the work.
Because I believe that our thoughts become our feelings. So when you think about dark things, you would also have an emotionally answer to it, that emotionally you would experience this dark side because you're busy with it. So who wants to experience non-stop fear or depression or whatever, so if you activate this. So if this is amplified, I believe that even if it's amplified and you have to struggle with it, it eventually brings you back to something where you want to live in, a warm bath, and not the cold water.
So again, I think I personally share your outlook on life to some extent, but I do think prisons are horrible settings, and in those particular studies that you talk about, this was one of their main concerns. How can we create a safe setting that invites emotional vulnerability amongst very masculine men that might continuously show invulnerability? So I think really putting the right amount of attention to setting and understanding the sort of contextual nature of these experiences is very important. And I do think that takes away a little bit of the romanticism that if we would just keep people, on psychedelics, that they will eventually break through to life.
I believe it's not for everybody.
No, I wouldn't say so. No.
I believe that there's a natural moment that this mechanism where fears and things we can't handle now are pushed to the side so we can function. That it's a natural moment when this box can be opened, and not in any time.
I would agree, and I would even add to that there's going to be moments when people take a psychedelic and actually sets their process back.
Yes.
Because they're not ready and they have an overwhelming experience and have too little familiarity with being vulnerable or being emotional or sensing these kind of things. And then you open Pandora's box and immediately close it again.
Absolutely.
And that's... this is why we need more information about what would be a good set and setting, whether you do it under guidance or on your own. Just have that information out there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
You, then Marta, and did you still have a question? First. Oh. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Because I think there's a meaning making and there's a somatic element.
Mm-hmm.
So in many cases there's some form of meaning, dismatch between meaning making and the feeling. So people feel something and their meaning making makes them decide that these feelings should be either disconnected or amplified. And then looking into what is happening there can help people to either amplify the positive emotions or amplify more ego tendencies or something like that.
I think this is a really important contribution, and this is why I think this is really a core aspect of understanding that even the moral and the moral sphere, the way we kind of interact with the world, is deeply embodied, is the moral sits in our bodies. Mm-hmm. I think this is the framework of Jared Zigan that really opens that understanding up, and to have visceral experiences of what is right or wrong, and also what emotions are, or how emotions emerge from the body. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the good insights as well. My question is, could you talk a little bit about the use of psychedelics, not necessarily with religious connotation or focus trauma, but for example, for things like if someone wants to be, say, more creative or wants to find what that person should be best in life, can you talk a little bit about how that could happen and maybe what to do?
I'm not sure if I would be the right person to address that. There is some research. I think David might know more, or some other people from APRA might know more. But there is a strong correlation between the capacity of psychedelics to enhance meaning making and the capacity to enhance creativity, and the enhancement of appreciation of aesthetics, including music. Mendel Galen did beautiful research in this area. And when you ask what to do with their life, to me that sounds like a religious question. And I understand religion in that case to kind of relate to the question of life and death, so to speak, the big questions that we can ask ourselves without having a sort of answer that is already implied in the question. So it's not a theological one, but a religious one. Does that make sense?
It does.
So
I'm not very knowledgeable about psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, someone, for example, doesn't feel that you don't have any focused trauma or any psychological thing or religious hatred, it's like what you would consider a normal person in an obvious terms. How do you what would be the best way to use psychedelics to be more creative or to find...
I think this ties back to the set and setting primarily, to really have your own intentions of this is why I'm going to do this, and to sit in a room with your sort of go-to creative expression things. If that's music, to have your instruments there. If that's painting, to have your painting things. I'm getting tired. And to, if that's poetry, to have something to write down. But I think we can spend a lot of attention and time on set and setting. But what we usually recommend within synthesis is follow the medicine. If the effects of the psychedelic come on and they take you inward rather than outward and into creative expression, follow that inward pool and see where that leads you, and have a sort of curiosity about it. And if you sit down and you have this, I'm going to work on my shadow and I'm going to look at that, and it's just showing you how beautiful life is, maybe that's something you can follow. Or if you just want to paint and make music and dance, maybe that's something you want to follow. Yeah.
That would be part of the integration.
Preparation, integration, and also the guidance during, and the setting you create for yourself. Yeah. Yeah?
I think there was this one paper from Grafstad from 2018 that's really recommended or liked.
Sorry, could you speak up a little?
I think there was this paper from, I don't know if I have his name correctly, but like Grafstad or something from 2018.
Hartogson.
I don't know why I said Grafstad.
I think that's this. This one. So I think his first name is Ido Hartogson, 2018. If you just look for meaning in psychedelics, you will definitely find it. It was published in Frontiers of Substance.
Yeah. So I have a question. Like the second one, the remarkable tendency of these agents to enhance the perception of meaning.
Yes.
Or in other words, to cause things to appear more dramatically meaningful than they would otherwise normally be. What does he mean by things?
So this is contextual within the article, and I'll be very frank. I'm not really sure what that in that moment refers to, but the way I understood his article is that things here relates to, for example, your own emotions, certain thoughts, music, basically anything in the set or in the setting. And that since our whole life narrative and the way we navigate the world and our own mental health relates to, I think that's one of those things. Did you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, no, because like from a personal experience, I would say that like in such a situation, like everything seems to be getting some kind of meaning. Like
Yes.
Eating a banana and then look at the banana and like, wow, like so beautiful. Like this banana is trying to tell me something. But it's like that's the thing with psychedelics. I think is that everything, because nothing makes sense anymore, you're trying to give meaning to things to make sense of the situation, and in that way, like you enhance meaning to things that are already meaningful to you, but also to things that are like normally totally meaningless.
Yes.
Like the banana peel or something.
So Aldous Huxley, in one of the first strip reports known as The Doors of Perception, describes a very similar experience as yours, in which he's looking at the chair, and it just has this profound divine quality that is just ever sort of communicating the beauty of everything to him in that very moment. So one of the ways you could look at that experience, for example, could be, oh wow, it's showing me something about the nature of reality, if that fits with your perception of life. It could also be interesting to explore, do I consider this information about psychedelics? Was that already a thought I was playing around with, and do I now have an experiential point of departure to explore how psychedelics could amplify meaning of my banana, and maybe of any other object? Yet another one could be to use the humanistic framework, or existentialistic, in which we see ourselves, humans, as endowed with this inherent capacity to have meaning in everything, even though sometimes through science we can objectively establish that there is none. That's what scientists would say. I'm not saying that is the truth. There's a lot of... we open a whole can of worms again. And according to Camus, this is called the absurd. The fact that we're given a completely meaningless reality with a banana, and that we as humans have this capacity to endow meaning on everything, first and foremost to identify it as banana, which is meaning, and then to have this wow. It shows us the absurd position we're in which on the one hand we know it's meaningless, objectively speaking, and on the other hand we are continuously giving meaning to something. And so we step into this absurd abyss, if you will, and the existential hero needs to fully give himself to the meaning he gives to his own life, while acknowledging that that meaning is inherently meaningless. So if, again, just to give you an impression of you can use a lot of different frameworks of understanding this experience, and in a one-on-one with someone that is very equipped at this and that knows your language and that can slowly start asking questions that could tease apart what it meant for you. Personally, I'm not too interested in whether it's true or not. I honestly am not always interested in that. I'm more interested in, does it add to your overall life satisfaction? And I think there's pathological ways of doing that, but I think in general there's a lot to say for that. I'm not too interested in whether God exists or not, but if your belief in it makes a massive difference for your life, then I would say let's have a conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have the feeling that it is also, like I said, you could give meaning to inanimate objects like the banana, but it also amplifies things that you already value. So let's say I'm an atheist, so I couldn't, like for one time I had this feeling that like an alien was hugging me or something, but then I thought like if I were to be religious, then I think that would be God or something like that. So I think that in general, if you're doing this in like such a religious setting, for example, with someone that is religious and guiding you, that automatically massively increases your chances of having like this divine kind of experience, if that is what you do.
Yeah, and I think this is both the beauty and the danger. And this is why we need to have very serious discussions around what spiritual integrity means in this context, what existential integrity means in this context, and how we want to conduct these types of therapies as they widen out to potentially very large groups of people. And we need to think about the entire process of preparation, having the experience, and integration. But I think there are ways of doing this work ethically, and I think this is so important that psychedelic chaplains and maybe ethicists and philosophers are really involved in the field of psychedelic science and psychedelic psychotherapy. Because of the questions that you're right now asking. Like, okay, couldn't it just make anything that is completely irrelevant deeply endowed with meaning? Yes, it potentially could. And then how do you make meaning of it, and how do you make sense of that? So, yeah, I think it's a good question to research. It's very warm, but I'm like, please keep going. Yeah?
Maybe your last question?
Maybe the last question. Okay, yeah, I mean, you tell me.
Then we can go have there's the basket, like the little bar, so we can go have a drink and you can ask more questions if Dan wants to stay.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
So last public question.
Maybe your question is the last.
The final.
That's the final question, and the rest is going to be over drinks.
I'm almost scared. I would like to ask about psychedelics and addiction, because I'm doing research on psychedelics in a religious setting to enhance creativity of artists, concretely musicians. And many times I noticed that they seem to say that they were so overwhelmed by getting the creative boost that they just wanted to keep on going. And they entered a certain vicious circle. I need more creativity, well, I have to take more psychedelics. And I would like to ask what is your opinion, or the opinion of chaplaincy on this? What
Just going to speak on behalf of old chaplaincy, or on behalf of psychedelic chaplaincy, which I think doesn't exist yet. So I can answer that question for myself, but I think your question is, are psychedelics addictive, or do they have addictive potential?
What happens if you get, in a way, addicted? Maybe it's not a topic which is much out there yet, but I saw it in my research that the artists kept on coming back, that I have to try it again. Yeah. And I saw a certain vicious circle. Like, what would be your take on it?
My understanding of addiction is quite radically different from that what is considered very mainstream, especially the sort of addiction as a sort of compulsion with a sort of brain thing. I understand addiction much more to be different expressions of experiential avoidance, and then what ties into that is the fact that certain substances and behaviors deeply influence our brain chemistry, and that has a sort of extra feedback effect in which it becomes more and more attractive to engage with that type of behavior or engage with a particular substance. That doesn't do justice to my understanding of addiction, but to give you just this sort of general thing. With that understanding of addiction, I think that you could get addicted to psychedelics. You could get addicted to a state in which you experience a lack of creativity. There's a lack of something. And now here's that thing that fills up that lack. And apparently there's something about that experience that makes you want to come back. And I think it's difficult to discern for how long that is a healthy process, in which maybe you want to dig a bit deeper, and just like 1 to 10 psychotherapeutic sessions are going to be different from 20 to 5 years in psychotherapy. So there might be differences in each experience, but if it becomes a sort of superficial attraction to a particular state of mind in which you associate with a particular experience that you're really looking after, maybe it could become addictive. But I think as a psychedelic chaplain, I would kind of want to know, so how do you feel when you don't feel creative? What is going on there? What is the thing that keeps calling you back? I think Alan Watts has this beautiful quote: "If you get the message, hang up the phone." And this is about psychedelics. So yeah, if you finally get why sometimes you feel trapped, then maybe hang up. We take the psychedelics as medicine perspective. We might say, well, maybe this is something you need to take every 3 to 6 to 12 months. And it turns out there is this neurochemical basis of addiction, and I'm completely off target, and that could be the case too. And then maybe psychedelics have addictive potential in that sense, or maybe they help. Again, let's complexify more.
So, from a neuroscientist perspective, I don't believe that psychedelics are physically addictive. Mm-hmm. Maybe psychological, people can abuse them in some way. And actually, there are like trials now that trying to study whether psychedelics can help with addiction. So like the other way around. Mm-hmm. But I don't think like physically, like neurally speaking, psychedelics can alter the brain in such a way that you need to keep using them to feel satisfied.
It's a psychological thing rather than
I think so.
Right, so in your example, that was like a very specific appraisal. So like the artists are saying that they psychedelics are making them more creative, so then they feel that they have to do that again.
A
And I
means
would
of
say,
inspiration.
are they actually being more creative, or do they just feel more creative? Also, maybe in terms of the question you were asking about creativity, I think it is kind of important to think of creativity differently than just neural enhancement. I think we have to think of creativity in terms of it being a natural function, which means everybody can be creative, because the only real definition I see of creativity is the ability to solve everyday problems, and we do that every single day. So in that sense, everybody is creative.
It was more the feeling that I'm productive in that sense, that inspiring ideas, and they are able to be verbalized or transferred. That's what I meant by creativity.
Okay. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, it's a nice way of looking into two perspectives.
Right. So I also don't like this sort of neural enhancement interpretation that I take psychedelic to be more creative. Like, I do believe to some degree you could say that what is inhibiting me from being creative is then inhibited by psychedelics, but I don't think that it somehow elevates you to something bigger or better than what you already are in that sense. But yeah, I think it's kind
Maybe take these issues back to the artist and see how they respond.
Yeah.
That's I'm now sponging.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna ask in second round. I'm gonna ask them more because thanks for that. It's giving me inspiration what to ask. Nice.
Yeah.